area. The whole of this brown area is what we consider arid and semi-arid, the arid area, the brown one. But we have this cream, which is the semi-arid. So almost the entire country, if you from this map, you see it's arid and semi-arid. And in Kenya, you know, arid, semi-arid cover nearly 80% of the landmass. And it's a host to a population of, it hosts almost 30% of the population of Kenya, which is almost at 48 million now. And approximately 70% of livestock from this particular country, Kenya, and national parks are within these regions, the brown and these areas that you see that are colored almost cream, you know. And for these particular areas, the main survival livelihood pattern has been pastoralism and agro-pastoralism. So we cannot ignore them when we are talking of the climate risk. And therefore we say there is need to tackle climate crisis within this region, but we need to come from the understanding of the gaps in adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, to appreciate that these people, part of this region, they contribute least in terms of climate change, but they're the most affected with the climate change. Sorry. Yeah, so when I go to the methodology that we used for this particular study, we used both, we've utilized both primary and secondary data, where we did some sort of stakeholder engagement and key informant research. And we did this in, we picked 4 counties, that was Laikipia. I don't know whether, so we picked Laikipia here. We went ahead and picked Samburu. We also went to Taita Taveta, where I'm pointing, and Kajiado, this part here. So reason being that these regions, you see, when you consider Laikipia, as Laikipia is almost near Mount Kenya, it's within the, it enjoys partly the Mount Kenya ecosystem, but it's on the leeward side of Mount Kenya. So it experiences it experiences that semi-arid kind of climate. Samburu, you see, is on this brown part. So Samburu is arid. And then Kajiado and Taita Taveta, they are semi-arid. And Taita Taveta, it's towards the coast, so it was really ideal. Then, you know, there is the issue of the inter-boundary. Down here is Tanzania. So there's also the issue of cross-boundary climate crisis. So, so we picked those 4 counties, and we engaged in focus group just to talk more with the beneficiaries, targeted beneficiary for some of the adaptation projects, and also people who are experiencing these losses, because we went at the time when there was a lot, the numbers were increasing. Almost 4 million people were in their need of both humanitarian and adaptation solutions, you know. And we augmented this by going through desk-based reviews, just looking and appreciating some of the adaptation efforts, mitigation, and the reports on this. And further, we did some content and thematic analysis. And so what was our main finding, because this is going to be really important, that for this particular area, the first picture on the frame, you know, they experienced drought, but like right now it's raining in Kenya in some part of this area, and the remaining livestock that survive drought die as a result of flooding, flash flooding, and heavy rainfalls with a lot of storm water, because, you know, everything gets dry and arid and almost like a desert. So by the time it's raining, so the rain carries with it almost everything, including the few livestock that is surviving. And it's almost intermittent that after a very severe drought, then there's a likelihood of experiencing this. And arid and semi-arid areas, they're now experiencing, for the first time within 2021, 2022, and 2020, apart from the rest of the world talking COVID, they also experienced swarms of locusts that were moving from the Saudi region, Ethiopia, into Kenya. So this region again got another tragedy of locust invasion. So this combined with like now poor infrastructure and poor national support system, leads just increases the climate risk for this particular region. And they experience just both economic, but increasingly, even the social fabric that supported their survival is also broken. So we are talking of just not more than beyond just economic losses, there's also experiencing non-economic losses. And local institutions which were pivotal to this community's survival are increasingly being weakened by climate extremes. So some of the uncommon, so there's that normal discussion, but there's also now what we can describe as the uncommon discussion, that within the midst of COVID and drought, there was locust invasion. So spraying happened, which became a maladaptation because in this region, again, they use other alternative means of survival. So like beekeeping is one of them, or apiculture. So when aerial spraying was done, most of the bees died. So that's one of the things that we labeled as a uncommon discussion in this kind of forum. The other thing is the issue about loss and damage, that during this particular period, you know, when we are going to talk loss and damage, then how do we account for livestock diseases that crop in during the time that there's extreme drought? So some of them, like the spread of East Coast fever, there's a lot of livestock movement and interaction. So East Coast fever and some of these diseases hit heart water and the pneumonia. There's an increasing, they are now becoming more severe in this region, and we are seeing new trends of diseases. Then the changes in water level, where some of these families, girls, especially women and girls, are forced to walk imagine walking between 2 to 7 kilometers in pursuit of water, because it's getting dry, yeah? And it's really dry that there's no rainfall. And the other discussion, as we ponder upon the other issues, is the issue of mental health. And it's becoming a problem, like for men in that region. They said they are facing this trauma of losing all the livestock, but meanwhile, you are you are expected to provide for your family. And for a man, without livestock, you are as good as dead for them. So increasingly, there's the issue of trauma, mental health, but gender-based violence also increased according to the discussions that we had. And strangely enough, now alcoholism is cropping up as a part of the mechanism just to kind of like go through that very tough period. But when you look at now, what are the discussions that we can relate to from what are some of the effort that focusing on our attention, that, you know, the ASALs have been characterized by flexible livelihood strategy, like now from pastoralism to agro-pastoralism, but we are seeing conservation agriculture being also promoted alongside the issues of like beekeeping and honey keeping, the nature-based solutions. Mobility, like there's movement cross-border, like between Kenya, Tanzania, but that is also being impeded by some of the regimes. There was cases where livestock from pastoralists that crossed over Tanzania were confiscated. So mobility is also under threat, but it's a survival tactic here. Conservation agriculture also has a role to play, but in these areas, they're increasingly, again, there's this sort of flexible agreement where you can graze on somebody's piece of land for payment, and we're seeing rise of conservancy, sorry, and change in terms of herd composition. Increasingly, the discussion like we had with the people in Laikipia, Taita Taveta, they say that the most important thing for them, because the picture frame I'm having here is just an example from Laikipia, where they're saying if they can get to do these small dams, and they're saying that the SDG number 6 on clean water supply and sanitation will be very important in the discussion for loss and damage. And social protection scheme, because there's government scheme where the government of Kenya has been doing cash transfers to some of these families. They say it's an important lifeline during the very severe periods of discussion, and that they think it's really necessary to be included in the loss and damage discussion. But importantly, that there's also need to recognize the social schemes that the communities have, like gifting cows, or gifting goats, or gifting sheep, just to enable families bounce back after extreme periods of drought and floods. So what are some of the gaps that we were looking at when you're talking of adaptation, mitigation, or loss and damage with the lens of climate justice? That most adaptation planning, still occurs internationally and nationally. With the locals, they say they feel left out. They just say people coming and telling them you need to now use climate information, you need to do this. So they feel left out in the major conversation on what is really necessary. And I've given an example, like they talk SDG 6, addressing SDG 6 will unlock the potential of that particular area. The second one is tackling adaptation and tackling and measuring both adaptation and mitigation is still a challenge because there are efforts made, but we at times fail to really measure the impact and there's no particular framework. So when we are looking at the literature on how this is measured and why it's not impactful, then there's no that kind of a scheme. And financing something like loss and damage, financing locally led adaptation is still inadequate, where we have county, in Kenya, we have a county government as at a meso level, but they're not fully financed to provide for this locally led adaptation, which is really important. And a clear understanding of loss and damage is needed in arid and semi-arid with robust and frequent data collection, so that if you're going to talk loss and damage, like now we have the livestock insurance schemes and other schemes, but the frequency in which you're collecting data, because I could insure my livestock during drought, but the droughts are followed almost immediately by floods. So how do you account for that kind of a thing under loss and damage? So there's need for a clear framework. And also there's need to do some sensitization at the county level, national, on loss and damage. Thank you so much, and I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. So we welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we can have questions on that because I think the second presenter online is not available yet. So if we can have questions on that so that we can transition to the in-person presentations. So 2-3 minutes of questions. It's a heated one. I see. Okay. Yeah. So we have questions for raised hands so far. If we can start from that end, then here, and then we'll go to Chua, and then we come to here.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Alphonse, my friend, for the presentation. However, it's very important for me that when you penetrated the community and used all those data collection methods, especially the FGDs, that was more of an interactive process. Were you able to collect data on local knowledge applications and how that probably has worked for these particular communities in terms of determining resilience for the future potential threats? Number two, we know that modern technologies have not worked because they're quite expensive, or we are still learning, there are still innovations, they're not proven technologies yet to determine either whether something will happen or just predict. And so I'm wondering, in these very particular communities, such local innovations in terms of the technologies that they have been using before, are they still in existence? Are they still applicable, or they are abandoned? And so that's why they are suffering more in this regard. Lastly, is basically about if there are particular recommendations that were given by the very communities, not in the academic sense or the consultancy sense, but generated by they themselves because they foresee, they have seen, they have been part of it. So they know what works for them and what doesn't. I thank you.
If you can keep the questions as concise as possible, or at least maximum of 2, so that we have questions from other people as well. that would be great.
Yeah, so do I get all the questions first, then respond?
Thank you, Alphonse. My name is Bridget Mugambe. I work with the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. Yeah, they've asked us to keep it at 2, so we'll choose 2 from this list. One, I appreciate that you've made a presentation that speaks also to pastoralism. And we know that in climate discussions, pastoralists have often been cited as, from the causative part of climate change, and we've not largely appreciated how they contribute to mitigating and adapting to climate change. So I just want a comment from you in regard to this narrative and how you see it as a challenge to dealing with some of the different issues you've raised, but also if there are actions, that pastoralist communities are taking that can be scaled up and recommended for loss and damage financing, so that one, they do 2 things. One, they dispel the narrative, but also they can be, recommended for support and not just look at humanitarian support for pastoralist communities. 2, I just want you to comment on the, I know one of the positive policies or that recognized for pastoralist movement is the transhumancy protocol, the IGAD transhumancy protocol. And if you see this as contributing to, dealing with some of these challenges, and if it's one of the policies that we can really put out there to support or to deal with these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you again both for your presentation. Of interest to me is to know what you mean by climate injustice. So can you just unpack a little bit in terms of what this injustice looks like in the communities that you work with, and also what are the underlying drivers of this injustice both nationally and locally? Thank you.
Thank you very much, our presenter, for that very good presentation. And I just wanted to add on some of the challenges that I feel you left out, especially myself coming from Kajiado County. I'm born and raised in Kajiado County. Actually, it's my home and everything. So when you talk of mental health, and you specifically talked of men, I just thought even women are even more affected mentally, because if you went down to the ground, you'll find, and going by presentation from my sister here this morning, you find that women have been more affected. Actually, we think because of the kind of society we come from, whereby women are not, it's a patriarchal society. They come from the Maasai community. And you see women had already existing challenges. And now when climate change comes, the impact, they feel it even more. And that's why we are talking about, they're not able even now to fend for their families as well as they used to do before, ending up with kids dropping out of school, because for the longest time, women at least supported girls to stay in school. And so I think the mental health, not just men who are affected, but women and girls and the youth in general. So you would want, it will be good to discuss about that. And I think if you tackle the northern part of Kenya, that is Laikipia and Samburu, which we also work with, it is good to talk about climate-induced conflicts. We know that because of the scramble for the resources, the pastures and water, and as much as there have been conflicts there before over other things, the impacts of climate change have also kind of increased those kind of conflicts, and so it will be good to also think of that, because we cannot run away from that. Right now, I know that there's so much happening in the northern part of Kenya, the pastoralist community. There's a lot of cattle rustling, there's a lot of killing, and most of it has also been contributed by the impacts of climate change. And yeah, because we have been taught to narrow to two, and we talk of mobility also. It is not just across the border. Yes, I am very much aware when our cattle, when we crossed to the border, were confiscated, but we are also facing even mobility challenges within the country. I know of some young people from my community who were just arrested the other day because where they were passing through during this drought, the current drought, they were arrested because they said, you are trespassing over, some individual people's land or somewhere that animals are not supposed to go through. So it's not just across the border, but even more internally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think those were comments and points for consideration in the research that's been done. We have one more question. One question.
Yes, thank you, Alphonse, for the good presentation. My name is Stephen. I think I'll just pick up on the question that was asked about the transhumance protocol. I don't know whether you checked around what the IGAD and FAO have done in terms of investments around early warnings and, of course, follow-up of that, as well as the counties, because I think some of those regions have been persistently facing those challenges. So then when you're putting together your recommendation, then we are actually clear that, because I have an issue with what you've proposed, whether it is enough or we are looking at the scale of it in terms of proposals around loss and damage. Because I think there should be maybe medium term as well as the kind of long-term investments that are actually needed to manage any future challenges such as this one. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I think we can have Alfonso tackle those questions. We're not doing so good on time. So if you can have those questions answered, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. If there's any questions on this session, let's keep them so that we can always bring them at the end of if we have saved some time.
Thank you very much. Participants for very useful questions. Yeah, so I want to tackle the questions, and I want to start with the question on the intersectionalities and the issue about the gender relation when it comes to climate crisis. Yes, I actually acknowledge the reason why there was that's, I think, the slide we talked about. I brought in the question of the issue about the uncommon discussion, because we've commonly, and we appreciate that when you look at the way men and women are affected by climate change, women are more vulnerable. So that we recognize in the study. But this was a discussion now that it's actually the women that brought it out, and they were saying that, in as much as we talk of climate change affecting men most, that women most, we are increasingly seeing our men looking to be disturbed when they are told that all the cows died, all the livestock, because they call livestock here mali. So mali likufa, mali lisha, all your livestock is gone. So men also now, there's that feeling of despair that now it's women who brought this conversation, that as we talk about climate change and climate risk, please also highlight the need to start now when you're doing the targeting in terms of mental health, as we're working with women, also start sessions for men, the discussion. So it's important to bring in, and then the whole thing about the intersectionality of gender, wealth, and sex. There's a lot that we discussed it in that spectrum. But I wanted to just highlight that as one of the keys so that we elicit this kind of a discourse. When it comes to climate-induced conflict, yes, this is really appreciated. And you see, like right now, the way it's so intense, the government has even, the government declared operations, disarmament program, but it's getting more and more. So it's one of the things that as we talk loss and damage, that other losses are also going to be as a result of these conflicts and as a result of this conflict that we need to address. And it's really important to address adaptation, address mitigation, address loss and damage among the pastoral community. So the various forms of mobility, yes, I highlighted the one for Tanzania, Kenya, just to appreciate that, and that is in connection again with the IGAD question of what they're doing about the Karamoja side, West Pokot, and the kind of investment that they're doing. Yes, that was also highlighted, but we were told this number of slides, so those investments, and I want to bring in, before I bring in the question about mobility. One is the tragedy of enclosure that we are seeing. They used to tell us tragedy of commons. It's not commons. It's tragedy of enclosure, where some of these pastoral lands, there are those who assume, in land and investment group, they assume these lands are they need to be transformed into other things. Others are kind of putting fences and serious barriers that impede mobility. And there's a lot of arrest. There's a lot of arrest and wealth from this pastoral is being taken away, which is really sad. And there's need now to properly map out the migration corridors. There's a project that tried mapping that out in Samburu, in around Turkana, but increasingly we need that because like in Kajiado, movement of the pastoralists is really impeded. So we are no longer talking about just the normal pastoralism, but there is a term urban pastoralism, where these pastoralists are within Nairobi, and they have to keep negotiating or buying spaces where they can graze. So when I get to the question about the investments around IGAD and transhumance, yes, they came up, and one of the investment is the investment around hay stores in some of these regions. So hay stores, it's one of the investment that is really working for this particular group. Like in 2020, 2021, the pastoralists in some of these areas said they were able to withstand the drought because of some of this investment, so which is really important to appreciate. However, not all investments that we propose in boardrooms work well, just as the first person, the first question that was raised on the issue of technology. And the question was on modern and to what extent do you bring the local innovations? So on the question of technology, you look at, do we look at it from a co-production element, where some technologies, like now, if you're doing hay production, hay stores, it's in line with some of the cultural practices among the pastoral community of setting aside land for dry season grazing. So now what they're doing is just that land that was set aside, they're now harvesting hay and storing. And the co-production, in the sense that some of the livelihood strategies and their survival technique, like in Kenya, the law about, and this I'm going to link it with the issue about Community Forest Act of 2016, where when that law was passed, the pastoralists around this particular area went ahead, and they're the ones now managing like Kirisia Forest, for instance. And these forests are now back, the vegetative cover is good, and they're increasingly, they're working, they're contributing to adaptation, they're contributing to mitigation, and they're also contributing in their own way of reducing loss and damage. And we can discuss this probably later, because my time is up, and my time is almost up. And so that's why, like, it's important to look at what technology, and does it exist within the social fabric or some of the systems that were existing? So are you improving? So technologies that work are the ones that really improve on what was existing and not totally replacing them. So for the early warning, like that was highlighted here, early warning system, it's a discussion that we might want to have. It's a cruel discussion, but it doesn't work in this particular community because we assume they don't have a way of producing their early warnings. They have a way. So what they ask for is one, are we able to appreciate what they have and their local ways of dissemination and work around those particular communities? There's projects that try to build on that, and they are working. There are other projects that are like trying to just only disseminate information, but they're failing. And finally, when you look at the discussion about pastoralism, there are many facets. And I'm not fully appreciating that everything the pastoralists are doing is 100% working. Then if they are 100%, the local knowledge was 100% proof, then we won't have even the discussion on loss and damage. But what we are saying, to avoid the romanticization, what we are saying is they need support in the sense that we are going to build on some of the existing institutions, but also support in the sense that, for instance, water is needed in this area. Can we provide the water? Something like schools are also needed here. Are we able to provide schools? Because these are some of the areas that have been marginalized by the government in terms of investments. So we can continue, but there are other questions. So like the transhumance protocol by IGAD, it's really a good program, especially in this particular region. And considering that pastoralist movement is really key for the survival. And this region, you know, feeds even like the Gulf of Aden, that particular area. So it's important that we kind of now further just continue sensitization and awareness around this particular area and building on some of protocols that work. So then the understanding about climate justice as I wind up. So climate justice, one.
Because we're out of time and we still have 4 presentations to go.
Okay. So if there'll be an opportunity, I'll come and address the issue of climate injustice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think time is not on our end. And there's a lot of, they're all heated topics that we need to talk about, but we're not good on time. So we still have three presentations. One is not available online yet, so we might not do that one, but unless we are guided. But I think the next one is in person. We are going to start in the order that they appear on the program. So we have Shenad Mazengera presenting next. We have 8 minutes for the presentation, and let's please stick to time.
Good afternoon. Yes, so my name is Shenad Mazengera. I'm presenting a research on the legal and regulatory frameworks on climate loss and damage. I'm doing this on behalf of CISONEC. You allow me to sit down so that I can manage my presentation better. Just as I don't know how my presentation can be seen properly there. Okay. So maybe as they are sitting up, I'll briefly talk about the background to the study. But I will focus my presentation on some of the key findings and the recommendations that were made. In terms of the background, as I've already said, this assessment on the potential for litigation on climate loss and damage was commissioned by CISONEC to look at the possibilities for loss and damage litigation for Malawi as an alternative to recover losses that are made by climate change. This was because of the slow progress that has been seen, or that was seen in the discussion to set up the Climate Loss and Damage Fund. And I think when we were starting to work on this assessment, the discussions at COP27 had not yet finalized. So that was also at the back of our minds as we were doing the study. In terms of the methodologies, I will not dwell so much on this one. This was basically a study on whether there are any potential pathways for litigation, for case action, or for using the courts to actually pursue loss and climate damage. As I've already said, in the absence of progress on setting up the loss and damage climate fund. So these were the main methodologies that we used. One was of course, a desk study review, looking at the available literature, both in Malawi, but also globally. So we looked at the different instruments, UN instruments. We looked at the different laws in different jurisdictions. We also did a mapping or a study of some of the case precedents. So we were looking at what sort of cases that have been decided by other courts exist, and can they be used to think about pursuing loss and damage litigation in Malawian courts, but also as an extension, maybe in other courts which are similar to Malawi. And of course, stakeholder consultations, looking at different stakeholders, civil society, but also mainly looking at some of the key government officers, the environmental affairs in the case of Malawi, the Ministry of Justice, and also foreign affairs, because at the back of our minds, we were looking at if Malawi is going to pursue loss and damage litigation on behalf of Malawi as a country, then it will have to be pursued by the government. So we also needed to talk to government apart from other stakeholders. There were about 3 or 4 main questions, and when I'm presenting the findings, I'll be highlighting some of the key findings under each of those questions. One was to review the international climate change and loss damage related legal and regulatory frameworks. So just to understand what is out there, and is it giving us a leeway to take up litigation or to take up cases in court. Looking at number 2, reviewing the literature related to loss and damage. This was mainly looking at some of the discussions, some of the global negotiations which had been going on loss and damage, and then looking at the case precedents on climate change litigation, including those related to loss and damage associated with climate change. So not just looking at climate change impacts, but also other related issues as well. And then the last 2 are drawing up some recommendations, as well as generating a report with those recommendations. In terms of some of the key findings, I'll start with the first question, which was looking at the international climate change, loss and damage related legal and regulatory frameworks. So in terms of the international frameworks, our key findings were that as much as there is a very strong climate change regime internationally, including, of course, the United Nations Framework Convention and all the other protocols, the Kyoto and the Paris Agreement, in terms of providing options for remedial action that countries or communities can take at the international level, our finding was that the legal framework for litigation specifically was quite weak, because most of the focus was on the adaptation. It was focusing much more on the mitigation, but there was not much in terms of providing a leeway or options for countries to take up legal action in order to enforce polluters or others, or which might be governments in the north, or actually companies to sue them, so to say. So we felt that much as the climate change framework is strong, but it was very weak in terms of providing that option for litigation. And what was also coming out was that most of the, because of that weakness, we are seeing a rise or a steep rise in some of the countries, in some in terms of states, in terms of non-state actors, and even individuals trying to resort to litigation using other means, domestic courts, regional courts, to try and push for compensation on loss and damage. And this was because the international framework is weak, so they were trying to use other means. So there, I think in terms of the framework for litigation under international law, very weak, although strong on climate change. In terms of the second question, which was really looking at the negotiations, our findings were that, discussions around loss and damage have been ongoing, and they've been going on for a long time. I remember when we were in the plenary, someone was saying for 25 years or 26 years, we've been discussing this. But in terms of specifically bringing out the issue of loss and damage, this is quite recent. I'm being told I have 2 minutes to go. So I will just highlight that in terms of the discussions, I think we all know COP27 was a significant moment, but I just wanted to highlight that there have been some key contentions. One is around defining what is loss and damage, but also the issue of liability. Who should bear the liability? Northern countries, they don't want liability, they just want support. While for the southern countries, they're saying loss and damage should be accompanied with liability. And then in terms of case precedents, what we found out was that in the global south, there are very few cases, but in the global north, US and Europe, there are quite a number of cases, especially in the United States, where cities are suing the government, maybe for environmental damage, for oil spillage, and so on and so forth, but they are linking it to climate change, not always around climate loss and damage, but most of the cases are still climate related. And then coming to Malawi, what we found out was that for Malawi, the legal and regulatory framework was also weak. It doesn't have a very strong legal framework. So, for example, the laws that are there on climate or disaster management, they are outdated. So we need a bit more stronger legal framework. There was also another issue that the courts are quite conservative, and they insist on a good standing local standard for anyone to pursue litigation. And that also acts as a challenge in terms of taking up cases. Some of the recommendations, I have 1 minute, I think, to just highlight that. Because we were looking at Malawi, one of the main recommendations that we were looking at was to make sure that the laws are ready to adopt or to accommodate loss and climate loss and damage on climate change. So we're saying when new laws are being made, like the Disaster Risk Management Act or the Climate Change Act, they should have specific provisions regarding climate loss and damage to make it easier for communities or even the country to pursue other countries or to pursue companies who can actually be the defendants. We were also saying that when we looked at the literature, it might be worthwhile to look at how we can use cases in other countries. For example, an NGO in Malawi can actually partner with another NGO, maybe in Europe, in the UK or in Germany. And there are 1 or 2 cases in our assessment which was showing that it is possible. But of course, it comes with a cost and some complexities in terms of jurisdiction. But we're also saying that the issue of local standard, because even at international law, looking at the issue of possession, but also looking at the issue of proof on climate change is quite a big challenge. It requires a number of experts. So that might be something that maybe in the frameworks, it needs to be a little bit more clear. And last but not least, we were saying that the issue of litigation should still be included as an advocacy issue by NGOs, because much as COP27 came up with this milestone on establishing a fund, there are still a lot of questions which need to be clarified in terms of course, defining loss and damage, but also defining the ambit and the extent of compensation, but also all the other unanswered questions in terms of non-monetary damage. So we were saying these might actually be resolved through litigation, because those questions can still be outstanding, so to say. I think with the time that I have, maybe that's where I can conclude and say that in terms of the conclusion, there is potential for litigation, but there are a number of challenges that might need to be surmounted in order for that litigation to happen. But we are also saying that litigation would still be important, even when the climate loss and damage fund is there, because there will still be a number of unanswered questions that need to be addressed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being quick and to the point. So questions on that presentation, can we keep them so that we have the other two presentations and then we have all the questions at the end? So the next, that was the presentation on the legal frameworks on loss and damage, issues of litigation and all that. Can we now have a presentation from Juliet, who's going to look at the case studies on loss and damage? So the same, you have 8 minutes to make the presentation before we move to the next presentation. Before Juliet starts presenting, if there's any person who came in late and they did not sign on the signing sheet, can you raise your hand so that the form should come to you? If you did not sign on the signing sheet, can you raise your hand so that the form should come to you? Thank you. Okay, so just a little change. So we are going to have Dr. Martina present first, and then Juliet will be at the end. Technical challenges, that's why.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it's Juliet after, then Martina at the end.
Hi, okay. I'm Juliet Sulio-Casito, the Climate Justice Program Advisor for Oxfam Great Britain, but based here in Malawi. We did a research on loss and damage. It was an action research combined with lived experience. So the title there is from one of the participants of the lived experience, but saying what I loved most and appreciated is now lost. A brief background, we decided to do this research because we wanted to have a narrative that is coming from Africa, that will include the voices of the people that have been impacted in the communities. We wanted to find out from the people that are involved in negotiations, in government offices, the CSOs, how do they understand by the term loss and damage? How can they define it? How can they pass on that message to others? How can they express themselves in decision-making meetings? So we had a number of objectives, but the overall, as I said, was to develop a contextualized and shared understanding of the term loss and damage, informed by people's lived experience in Southern Africa, by employing a decolonizing and participatory action research approach, using qualitative methods that brings together voices of Southern African actors and those experiencing the loss and damage from climate change. We looked at 4 countries, that was Malawi, 3 countries, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. This research was done by our consultants who had colleagues in the 3 countries. So the first objective was to support the leadership and empowerment of Southern Africa NGOs and activists, the Southern Africa group of negotiators and decision makers on loss and damage, contribute to COP27. This research was done last year towards COP27. Contribute to COP27 being an African COP that reflects and influenced by leadership of African civil society activists and decision makers. The other was to co-create with Southern Africa NGOs and activists, Southern Africa group of negotiators, decision makers that defines, contextualizes, demonstrates, illustrates, and evidence the macro and human impacts of loss and damage in order and for the Southern Africa context, to help overcome the barriers and limitations to African civil society activism, campaigning, and communications on loss and damage, complement other loss and damage research work that are already there, that have been done by Oxfam and other partners and other organizations as well, to develop a learning on how to decolonize action for climate justice. The methodology that we used, we did the lived experience, whereby also key informants were interviewed, and online workshops. As I said, loss and damage has a lot of definition from across the global north, global south. We also looked at those documents. There was a desk research that was also done. So the first online workshop was mainly to establish the understanding of terms loss and damage from different stakeholders' perspectives, and to solicit recommendations and action points on the way forward regarding understanding loss and damage from a multi-sectoral perspective. The second online workshop was to understand loss and damage from the lived experience generated through the 3 case studies that was done in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. And the last online workshop was to conclude the series of workshops on loss and damage by reaching a consensus on the most appropriate loss and damage narrative based on the stakeholder workshops and lived experience from the 3 case studies. This is a screenshot from that was taken from we were running Mentimeters on during the online workshop. We were saying, how do people understand loss and damage? So these were some of the responses from the participants: suffering, injustice, reparations, shattered hopes, deprivation, and a lot more. This is how the participants that attended the online workshop defined loss and damage, their understanding of loss and damage. This is just voices from the lived experience, and that's a woman crossing one of the rivers in Chikwawa. Though there used to be a bridge, she's coming from a field. So she risks her life crossing that crocodile-infested rivers to get to her farm and then back to the family where she stays. So this is Joyce Lucas. She says, what I valued most and appreciated is now lost. My life is now at a risk. I really do not know what to do. I would love to go upland, but it needs money. So this also comes up from when we ask them, what is loss and damage to them? What would they want to see from loss and damage? So this come out from the loss and damage fund. That's what they want from the loss and damage fund. They really want that money to go to them so that it can help them. The other one was from Gift Zikuyo. I was greatly affected by the loss of my family and belongings and went into a depression that resulted in my blood pressure getting too high, which caused a stroke. My left side was affected, and because of that, I can no longer work for my family as I used to do before. I am now permanently disabled due to the impact of Cyclone Idai. This is Gift Zikuyo from Zimbabwe, and this is the other part of loss and damage that we're talking about, that they are seeing, the one that money cannot buy. This person now has struck because of the Cyclone Idai that had hit Zimbabwe. This also is another question that came out from the Mentimeter that we ran, that this is after we brought in the lived experience from Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. What really came out was people living in fear, the trauma that has caused depression, anxiety, the finance for rebuilding, poverty, loss of assets, loss of livestock. I think we have heard from most of the presentations what people have lost when these cyclones or when these droughts hit their regions. The human dignity itself. This is a framework that we developed during our research. We're calling it a framework for framing the loss and damage narrative. We divided into 4 parts. The first part was saying it should be inclusive. What do we mean by we want to do? For it to be inclusive, we're saying we need everyone else to be in these discussions of loss and damage, the communities that are impacted, the government players and negotiators, civil society and NGOs, the private sector themselves. In Malawi, we have Eskom Water Board. We want these bodies to be part of these discussions because they're also impacted by this loss and damage. What do they want? How can they prepare? How can they be assisted from the knowledge that is out there? And also talking about the research and academia, we need more research to define the African narrative for the loss and damage. How do we want it to be addressed? The previous presenter was talking about the laws. What laws are there? What are we supposed to follow? How can we protect those laws that they really help us? And as well as from the academia, what our students, what are people in the schools, what are they learning? How are we bringing in this climate change? How are we bringing in loss and damage? What is their understanding? How can they help to the outside world? The second part, we said we should look at it in a holistic way, whereby we're saying to capture everything, like the biophysical losses and damage, the ecological loss and damage, the social losses and damage, the cultural losses and damage, the economic losses and damage, and the mental health and psychological well-being of human beings that have been impacted, especially those that are living in the communities. And the third part was it should be focused to differentiate loss and damage in terms of tangible and the intangible. This should be looked at it together, not separate, but because if we bring in the tangible and the intangible losses, it means we'll not leave anyone behind. We'll be moving the same direction. The last part was saying it should be context specific. We're looking at Africa, we are in different geographic areas. Others are facing droughts, others are facing cyclones, storms, a lot of different impacts, climate change impacts, but they're all leading to losses and damages. So we're saying we should look at the context specific stuff so that everything should be covered from all angles. In conclusion, we said Whilst it contested that there is need to be able to characterize the losses and damage experienced within an African context as distinct from other regions of the world. Not all impacts are quantifiable or even comparable across cultures. Loss and damage can include cultural symbols, places that people identify with, or even ways of life. Values and losses are shaped by social context and by people's experiences and daily practice. Knowledge of loss, therefore, requires accounting for the inherently subjective nature of values and how those values are across human experience. And the other conclusion was the narrative, as I said, should be inclusive, holistic, and capture the loss and damage, as well as the context, to define the context. The recommendations that we came in with, we're talking about the African leaders, civil society groups, activists, negotiators should be equipped with an in-depth understanding of the lived experience of people who are suffering tangible and intangible losses. The intangible loss and damage need to be described, acknowledged, and integrated into policy decision on loss and damage, which also take into account the uniqueness of different experiences. Finance to address the loss and damage is urgently needed to scale and should go towards both tangible and intangible loss and damage, including for trauma and psychological healing and cultural and social restoration and renewal. African countries must solidify their partnerships and continue to work together towards placing the stories of African communities and people most affected by loss and damage at the forefront at center international climate negotiations and discussions. There should be more investment in research to explore intangible loss and damage. Also brought in a few recommendations on to decolonize the narrative of loss and damage, so to amplify the voices of frontline and disadvantaged communities most affected by the climate change and involve them in climate planning and policy making. African leaders, negotiators, journalists should be equipped with information as well. Break knowledge hierarchies and co-produce mutually beneficial knowledge using the research to help a contextualized, localized narrative. Acknowledge and appreciate the diversity between different cultural groups and understand the loss and damage narratives can differ based on context and other categories such as gender, situation that climate challenges within local context is an important step into decolonizing the narrative. Conduct climate or loss and damage campaigns and advocacy that are informed and connected to impacted communities. Decolonize climate change education by giving multiple forms of knowledge and equal representation in the climate change narrative. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2014 concluded that given its holistic nature, indigenous knowledge provides an in-depth understanding of climate risk that enhances the climate adaptation process by informing policy and practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that was a show of the lived experience, but also contributing to the narrative around loss and damage. If the questions should be compiled and then be asked at the end. The last presentation for this session is coming from Dr. Martina. So if you can have Dr. Martina present the last presentation for this session, and questions should also be collected, and at the end of that, we're going to have this question and answer session. And you have 8 minutes. Oh, my presentation is on, okay, sorry, my name is Martina from Dr. Martina from the University of Nairobi, and my presentation is on effective response to damage and loss. And I am looking at climate change, specifically the effects that we have in Kenya. And I'm also looking at the pastoralist communities, especially the Maasai in Kajiado County in Kenya. What you find is that pastoralist community in Kenya occupies this arid and semi-arid areas that constitute around 80% of the semi-arid area in Kenya. So all those are pastoralists, and they have livestock worth $1 billion US, and they contribute 36% of our agricultural GDP. Actually, the livestock is the source of food, wealth, and health for the pastoralist communities. The statistics there show the kind of animals that we have in Kenya. We have cattle, we have beef, we have goats, sheep, we have camels, and we have poultry and also donkeys. And then this red meat is consumed in Kenya, and most people prefer it. 80% of Kenyans prefer the red meat. Why? So why are we talking about climate change? In Kenya, what we have experienced most is drought, and we have had subsequent droughts since 2010. For this reason, you will find that the pastoralist communities that depend on pasture for the survival of their animals have not been able to overcome the shocks, because the drought has made it impossible for livestock, for pasture to recover because of the subsequent droughts. And then we have water drying up, and they depend on it. We also have conflict because of this limited pasture. We have starvation for humans and malnutrition for children. You will find that there's domestic conflict because of inability to cope. When there's no food, you've lost the animals. A lot of the times you'll find there's conflict, and there's disruption of education for the children. Some go to look for pasture, others have no food, so they don't go to school. So about the Maasai community that I am presenting on, or I capitalize on, you'll find that it is one of the counties, Kajiado County, where the Maasai community live, is one of the 47 counties in Kenya, and the area that they occupy is arid and semi-arid. What you find about the Maasai community is that they live near Nairobi in Kajiado County, and a lot of the land in Nairobi is being bought, or the Maasai community, because of land tenure issues, they happened to get title deeds. However, before that, Maasai land was communal. Animals could move from one farm to another. But since people got titles and they started fencing, now moving animals from one place to another is difficult. And you find now most people are selling land because they have a title. And then also it's near the Nairobi conservation, whereby we have wildlife, and there's a conflict between the animals and the wildlife. And then again, because of capital city of Nairobi, there's urbanization. And that's why somebody was saying when they go, they are arrested because they are getting into people's properties. So this drought that just ended last month really didn't end, but rains have now setting. So the statistics show that over 300 cattle from the Maasai community were lost, with that cost around 13.6 billion Kenya shillings. We have so many children that are out of school. We have so many families facing starvation. And a lot of the times you find women are bearing the burden, because men, some are so depressed, others have gone to look for after the animals. So women, the burden is falling on them. What has the Kajiado County done, or the government of Kenya, what are the strategies they are using to cushion the families against the shocks? We have the cash transfer to households that are hardly hit. We have food programs for children who are going to school. We have the off-take strategy, whereby you find the animals, the government encourages people to sell them so that they can buy others after the drought.
And then we also have relief food, like here you can see the governor of Kajiado is flagging over a truck which has relief food. And then also there is a lot of awareness going on so that people can know what climate change is and how they can prepare themselves for it. The unique thing about the Maasai community, and you find that animals actually constitute their way of life. Men are in charge of the animals and they take care of the meat, hides and skin, and the milk belongs to the woman. Large herds of cattle signify wealth and dignity. They believe, and it's part of their culture that you must keep many animals. And then the cattle is deeply entrenched in their culture. They use it to pay dowry. They use it for conflict resolution. And also, there are some things they settle using cows. Even when you kill someone, there's a way, number of cows you pay, and that is settled traditionally. Then you find milk and meat constitute the main food for the Maasai. And Kenya relies a lot on red meat, and the slaughterhouses like the one you are seeing there is an economic stabilizer. It creates jobs for the Maasai and also a market for their animals. And most of the land by the Maasai is arid and semi-arid, not good for agricultural crops. So what should we do given that background of the Maasai community? When we want to do a responsive damage and loss, how should we go about it? The first thing we need to do is to be data-driven. We are making decisions from a point of information. We begin by a survey, whereby we want to get the real information. We qualify and quantify the kind of loss that we want to address. And we categorize the type of damage and loss. My presenter just left, she talked about economical, social, and all that. So then we have to look at through observation, ethnography, lived life experiences. We have to document the interventions. We have to document what is happening and how we can get solutions. We have to look at focus group discussions where we put women together and men together so that we can understand the roles each one of them plays. Again, we are talking about traditional knowledge. We have to understand what is it that we can incorporate in our strategies so that that can help us solve the problem. From there, that is where we come up with awareness, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience strategies. So that is a strategy I have come up with, whereby from the survey, the FGD key informant interviews and case study, we come up with a strategy. And this strategy, for it to be implemented, we have to have national special climate change, special vehicles, regional and grassroots, whereby we can use organizations at the bottom to be able to implement and target directly the populations that are affected. So they look at the implementation on awareness, mitigation, and adaptation. Resilience is done at the bottom, but we have special vehicles in between that can be used to organize and manage the climate and loss kitty. So we are talking about awareness. We have to have enough information. People must know what climate change is. For communities, through media, through organized events, people must know, because you find many people actually do not know what climate change is. And that is why for them, mitigation also becomes difficult, because they don't know what constitutes mitigation. So mitigation, you can see among the Maasai community, there is burning of charcoal, there is using of firewood, there is overgrazing. All those, if they know what climate change is, then they'll be able to mitigate against those practices. Also adaptation. Adaptation is whereby now for us to be able to sustain our herds of cattle, which are very important because we need that number of animals in our country. We need to look at ways, sustainable ways for fodder, sustainable ways for water, sustainable ways in which we can utilize byproducts that are coming from the animals. And then this is just kind of grass that is very is climate change friendly, the Bachiaria grass. Then the last thing is resilience. Once we find that climate change is here with us, there are some things that we may not get away from. We look at diversification, whereby we grow other type, we don't depend only on meat and milk. We try and see whether we can bring other things on board, beekeeping, programs for schools, tree planting, and many others that are just outside the animal economy. Then what is my conclusion? My conclusion is that climate change, the damage and loss mitigation or solutions must focus on the underlying issues, and we don't rush to just bring disruption to the communities. And all the funding that is coming from the funding groups and governments and other new sources should look at identifying, supporting activities towards identifying the actual problem and effects. Specific budgets for possible interventions, setting up accountability centers where monitoring and evaluation overseeing is done, and then actual implementation. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So those were our 3 presentations. One looking at the lived experience and supporting the construction of the narrative. Another one looking at the litigation, the legal framework and all that. And then the other one looking at the adaptation and mitigation and strategies, especially looking at the Maasai community. So questions, comments? So I think when you're raising your question, you should be able to identify this is going to this presenter and this is going to this presenter. So let's start from this end and then, yeah, this end.
Thank you very much. My name is Gabriel Manyangatse. I'm from the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. Therefore, my question is linked to issues of faith as part of the losses that people suffer. It's directed to Dr. Mazengera. On number one, I'll start off on the issue of locus standi. You say that at times don't proceed because there is lack of the locus standi. Is it the lack of the capacity of those that are affected to stand for themselves? Or is it that they are not available and willing? What exactly makes it difficult to have that locus standi when we have people who are affected day in and day out, and we have the evidence of those that are affected? And my second question is directed to Martina, which when looking at the pictures, I noted that the parents are also now joining their children at school to actually partake of the feeding. Did we also maybe extend our questions or maybe our data gathering in terms of the social standings and the trauma that comes with the parents who are joining the queue for the children at a school to also receiving this kind of support? And the third question, I've already given it to Juliet, so she'll also answer it along the other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, presenters. And I only have, I think, 1 or 2 responses to my sister here, Dr. Martina. Of course, her research was based on my people. And so you can imagine somebody speaking on you. but you did a good job. I can see you've really tried to capture most of the issues that we are facing. And thank you for talking on our behalf. Now, I think from your presentation, I note that you mentioned that the Maasai, the fact that they have their individuals' titles, that one has made them to sell the land, and also because we border Nairobi. I don't really think it's because we have our titles. That's not the reason my father would sell land. And it's not really because we border Nairobi. That's why my uncle will sell land. The bottom line is the poverty that is continuing to make my community poorer. They are already the climate change, the impacts of climate change are making them more poorer. And so I think if we address that, then we will stop. For the longest time, we've always been accused, you people, you keep selling your land, but they don't really understand the reason as to why we sell land. The reason is just that we no longer are able to meet the basic needs because of the poverty. And so I think that one should come out a bit clearer. And then on the issues, I've heard you talk about the responses from the county government. And I think as much as they have tried to us, that was 1%. So you can imagine they ought to have done much more than what they did. And of course, out of the various kind of responses that they tried, like the cash transfers, I think it would have been better if you also told us about the challenges that this brought about. Was this fair? The politics in my county, where even the clanism that is there, and we ended up having one family that is aligned to one leader benefiting because that family or that they come from the same clan with a particular identity. So there were so many challenges that came with that, which would have been good, because if we talk of the interventions and we don't say whether they were effective or not, we will end up painting a very, very wrong picture. We will say, you see, these people or this government is doing very much or very well, while in deed sense, when you come home, you realize that my neighbors received a packet of maize flour, for instance, or some cash transfer, and the immediate neighbor did not, because of reasons that, there are so many reasons behind that. And so we should also talk of those challenges. Of course, I know it can be difficult for the outside world to know that, but we know that those problems are there. And also, I think you are aware that the stock, is it called the stock take? That not the off-take, yes, that the government really publicized, that the deputy president came flagging, off the program. Never, it never moved past that. It ended at that. And so I think you should also take note of that. And yes, those are my few comments on that.
Okay, so since we're not so good on time, and the two of us also need to go and facilitate the session in room 1. So maybe if you can respond to the questions that have been raised now, and then the other questions should come in the other session. So let's go have the health break, and then come back and finish it in the other session. But for now, I think those questions that have been raised can be answered. Yeah.
I can begin, Faith. Okay, I can begin. The first question was about social, my presentation on children that are having feeding programs. There was a different strategy for the children and the parents. The parents were getting relief and the cash transfer. However, in a photograph there, you can see parents carrying plates. Actually, those parents were going to the schools and joining the children as they were being fed, given the food. So it is because, like she's talking about poverty, so that is why you find even programs for children the parents are just going to, especially for food, they are going to join. Then we have about selling of land and poverty and urbanization. I know it is poverty, but before the subdivision of land in Kenya for the Maasai community, it used to be, they used to have communal titles, they used to have ranches, and nobody could sell. But the minute that change took over and people had the title, when you have a title, you can sell. You can sell because of many other reasons, but that subdivision actually escalated the selling that is being done. The last question was about the cash transfers. I just looked at some, they are not enough. Those are the ways in which the county government was cushioning the Maasai community. It wasn't enough, it wasn't fair, and it's only that we cannot discuss our kind of politics in Kenya, whereby the one who has is the one who is given the most. So when you look at my strategy, I'm coming from survey where you qualify and quantify at household level genuinely, so that you can know this one has, this one doesn't have. And then in the conclusion, I'm talking about specific budgets and the setting up of accountability centers, so that we avoid situations whereby action is just done, but it is not data driven. So you will not even find an avenue for you to say this one didn't deserve, because there is no data that is telling you who deserves and who doesn't deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll respond to the question on locus standi, which is a test that the courts use to determine whether you can actually pursue your case or not. And there are three main reasons why it is a challenge. The first one is, of course, the issue of capacity, but it's capacity because climate change litigation is a new area of work. And the main challenge is coming in where the courts are asking, how do you prove that the climate change or the impacts which are happening, for example, in Malawi, are caused by maybe a company in the United States. So you need very good expertise to show that linkage of causation, to say the impacts that are being suffered in Kenya have actually been caused by the carbon emissions by these countries or by these companies. And so the required legal proof is a bit higher than maybe if we just look at the impacts, the flooding or maybe the drought, but it's actually proving that in court that the cause is such and such. The second reason why it is a challenge is related to the first one, and it's because of the conservative nature of the courts, and not only in Malawi, in the cases that we reviewed, even in the other jurisdictions, the courts have been very conservative. They are more willing when it comes to just environmental damage, which is much more easier, because then you can link it maybe to a company or to an individual. But when it comes to climate change, it's a developing area of jurisprudence and litigation. So the courts have not yet fully embraced that. And from our perspective as civil society, as governments, I would say that maybe that's why one of the recommendations is also that we need to have a much more stronger, clear legal framework defining climate loss and damage, and also defining who can actually take up the cases. And then the last part, I think you asked whether those who are affected are unwilling or they are not ready. But I would put it as maybe there's need for more awareness, because like if I can even just take the example of the Cyclone Freddy, which has affected Malawi, most of the responses, of course, to support those communities. But I've only seen one organization, I think it was Amnesty International, which was talking about Malawi should pursue, compensation for loss and damage. But broadly, you find that awareness among those affected, awareness among civil society, even awareness among government key departments is very low in terms of how to go about claiming or asking for compensation around loss and damage. So I would say that if people are much more aware, it's much more easier for them to be willing and support climate loss and damage litigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think can we write down our questions and then we bring them into the next session. Oh, there's a question for you.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Hello. This is a question from Gabriel. He says, the faith dimension makes a greater part of the African life. How much loss was suffered by the communities because of the cyclones? I'll take this from the presentation. I think I presented a framework that we came up from our research. The first I mentioned 4 parts were say inclusive, holistic, focused, and cultural specific. So I'll respond to your question from the inclusive and holistic approach. The inclusive, I mentioned, of communities need to be included in these discussions. So the faith community is supposed to be in that. So you need to make yourselves available when we're doing those discussions. The second part was, I was talking about a holistic approach where I was saying that would need to capture the losses and damages suffered by the communities, the different angles to collect these. So one other part that I mentioned was the social and the cultural. So I would take this as a social cultural losses and damages. So it means the faith organizations are also, the faith community are also included in this. What's needed from you guys, the faith community, please make yourselves available in such discussions so that you should be heard. You should bring out your experiences. You should bring out what you need from this loss and damage fund. Thank you. I think I can say that for now.
Great, thank you very much. Let's have those questions in the next session. Not so good on time. And we have, I think, 3 presentations in the next session. So it's a marathon. But for now, let's break and have our lunch. Coffee break. Coffee break, yes. And then we are back here as soon as possible. Maybe, I think the best would be just to go and bring those things here and have the discussions here as we're drinking our tea and coffees. Yes? Great. So if we can give ourselves 5-10 minutes and then we come here. Yeah.
I was going to suggest that we just wrap up and then go all at once because it's already 4:20. It's already close to 5.
Okay. So, okay, maybe we will leave and then we'll tell those people that they should reserve the things for you. Yeah. Yes. Yes? Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Sorry for running.
What do you want to check if that person is online? The lady is Gabrielle. Gabrielle? Yeah. Is she ready? John is here. Start in the room. So my one is still not enough. He's one of the presenters. Oh, you introduce me and then Sani. Okay. And Gabriel, I need to check they're both online. John is online. And Isaac is there. Yeah, so meantime, okay, we'll start with Sani and Isaac. How many minutes? 8 minutes. This is Isaac who just said. This is Isaac here. This is Isaac there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Just after starting, what did you do? Shana. Did you use your own computer?
Yeah, you can use my computer, no problem. Yeah, I'm controlling from there, but my laptop, I will be able to do that. Yeah, so if the presentation is there, use it here, and we are controlling from there.
Which side?
That's here. Once and then they're able to
Build from there.
yeah, to see which screen is shown. Okay.
And also that's knowledge building. So that knowledge building and capacity actually for them to know that first examining, you know that in the next 5 months, and then you have empowered them. You know, 5 months to the council. Now to win things. They don't get the so there is a lot to be done. We need fast to recognize that this is a cycle and they have to take action. So they must sell the car. If we calculate that is telling us in the next 5 months, sell the house. So it
No, it's just too much information on my. It works with my laptop because there are shortcuts. But for here, for me to find the path, I have to start thinking what job was that one.
Yeah. Okay. No.
What job was that? What job was that? So nango difuse fonti na panga zawa za sosoneke. Sisi mangula mabiba laki.
My work was done 2022, June, May. Before
how did they find us? They worked harder than you. You know, I'm going internet.
Maybe they were doing I don't know. Of course, my bias is normally policy, governance.
So the Kenya wants a meeting with parents.
So because of this here,
So I keep it here in the valley and catacomb. Morning. Beaver birds flying
Whose laptop is this? It's yours.
It's mine, yeah. He wants to use it for
Another presentation.
Okay, well done for the presentation.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Tough questions.
Yes?
Tough questions you got. No easy questions.
Yeah.
how are you?
I'm good to this. Well done.
Good.
Very interesting.
No, when I have the final after.
Share the stuff we talk about with us and articles and different, similar to you with different.
Just. I want to do the local identity global.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. That's right.
Yeah, that's no, I already heard from you. You know, I have it from local to global.
Yeah. It's been recorded, there's a rapporteur as well. Yeah.
It would be good.
Yeah.
unfold between the two, you know, topics. They're really good this afternoon.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, yeah, the one in another room was very good.
Yeah, both of them were good.
Exactly.
All right,
Yeah.
all the best.
CD. Yeah. Oh, no. We try and integrate this. A lot of the stuff came up today around health support. We're going to be coming more vulnerable. That's what we're trying to do. Stand alone. This program is on the What time do you can't finish at 5 o'clock? Half five will be okay. Yeah. That's all the IT people. Yeah, that's right. The IT person. Yeah, that's what we really need. Okay. So I was introduced to them, you can Q&A. Remember just do these two people first, just in case there's any issues there. So while we're answering questions, make sure that otherwise you just be sitting there waiting. This person will know. These are both. Now we as well. Natural resource management. Are you staying in the Golden Peacock species? Is it? No, well, I've never stayed there now. Just you don't really need the air conditioning, it's not that warm. So. You want to have That's the thing with Aboriginal road, they're just way out. It makes it not easier. Okay. So we don't have the here. So you just tell them what to do. You tell them what to do. To Masani.
All of us, right?
Yeah, you sit there. Okay.
Am I going first?
Yeah, you can go first.
Let's see else.
You can sit there. If you want to.
Masama kumafuta. Hey. Hey. Kuplanta ya kugwa mvula.
Mvula ikugwa ndi tikuza bwanji somani.
So pia.
Zikenda kwenda zochaka cha maso zomwezo so.
Zikopya.
Ah, okay.
So your presentation is about non-economic loss and damage, is this?
Yes. I'll talk about non-economic loss.
Masani, what's yours about again?
Methodologies.
Methodologies.
So I think we're all speaking to the methodology.
Hello. Hello. If we know our neighbor is out and we have a number, a telephone number, let's call them to come back. Otherwise, the time is not with us. Yeah. Okay. Do we have the rapporteurs in here? The people taking notes, rapporteurs? You are the rapporteurs? Ah, okay. So we are okay. The presenters are here. 2 of them.
1, 2.
How many do you have?
2 in person and 2 online.
Oh, 4. So the terms. Huh? Oh my goodness, but we're supposed to start. Otherwise, there's a small announcement. So Rashid, we just have to start. That's what you are suggesting. Ah, okay. Thank you so much. So there's a bit of a change. I will not have plenary today. We'll have plenary tomorrow morning. So the chairpersons and the rapporteurs, after this session, you need to sit and consolidate the reports so that tomorrow morning we just start with reporting back. Is that okay? All right, so I think we can proceed. Otherwise, after this, then we disband to tomorrow. We're not going to reconvene again for today. We want to reconvene tomorrow morning. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Chimwemwe. So we'll try and get out of here by 5:30 at the latest. So myself and Lucy will help facilitate this discussion. So for this session, we're going to be looking at the documentation and methodologies for capturing loss and damage. So we'll have two presentations from inside the room. Dumansani will talk about methodologies for quantifying loss and damage. And Dr. Isaac will talk about looking at methodologies specifically for looking at non-economic loss and damage. And then we'll have two online contributions from Dr. John Kazambe from Luana and Gabrielle Robbins. So like we did for the first session, we'll start with the two presentations in the room, have a round of questions, and then we progress to the online presentation. So I think we can start with Dumansani. Are you okay to go? Okay, then over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dumisani Chirambo, and my presentation is on trying to find a way or methodologies for which we can actually quantify non-economic loss and damage. So in the interest of saving time, I will not go through all the slides that I had today, but essentially my assignment under CISONEC was to look at what is happening globally in terms of trying to quantify loss and damage, and then work with the different actors in Malawi to find out what they are doing in trying to assess non-economic loss and damage, and then finally to come up with some recommendations as to what methodologies can be adopted across board here in Malawi when we are trying to quantify non-economic loss and damage or try to put some proxies towards non-economic loss and damage. The introduction was basically just trying to talk about climate change impacts. I'm sure from the various conversations we've had today, we know what is happening in terms of infrastructure being destroyed, ecosystems being destroyed, as well as mitigation and adaptation practices not being sufficient to reduce vulnerability and also to help with the resilience of communities. We do have so many policies in Malawi. For example, in the agriculture sector, there's the National Agriculture Policy, which also tries to talk about how we can adapt to climate change. We've also got the Paris Agreement and the National Determined Contributions that have put in so many other incentives as well as strategies that can be deployed by the private sector and NGOs in trying to adapt to climate change and also to mitigate climate change. But as most of you are aware, even with all those things that are happening, we are seeing that vulnerability is still increasing in different communities. And even this year, we saw how Cyclone Freddy actually affected all of us. So the challenge which we have is that when we come to loss and damage, when we look at the economic impacts, they are quite easy to categorize because they deal with marketable goods as well as some things that are very tangible and people can actually see them. But the challenge comes with non-economic aspects. When we look at things like life, loss of life, how can you actually quantify that? If we look at biodiversity as well as the loss of ecosystem services, those are aspects that are very important to our daily living and to our livelihoods, but they go unnoticed in most of the climate change assessments. So various people, not only in Malawi, but globally, even in the Paris Agreement, they are coming to a realization that we really need to also look at both the economic and non-economic loss and damage coming from climate change impacts. And what can be a very controversial issue is that the perspectives on loss and damage from the developing countries and the developed countries are quite different. With the developing countries like Malawi, we accept that climate change is something that has been caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases, and as such, we need to, or the international community needs to do more to also look at how they can help us in terms of loss and damage. in the sense of the developed countries, they do not want to take liability for such an action because again, it also increases their costs and also it has got implications on the amount of money that they can be distributing to developing countries. So that's why we see that loss and damage is a feature that is coming up more often in global or international discourses. But what is happening is that the approach to manage or to handle loss and damage does not have a global consensus. But for even us to have that global consensus, there's the need also to be able to quantify what is actually being lost and what is actually being damaged. So with the economic ones, it's quite easy to quantify, but with the non-economic ones, that's where the challenge is. And that's why this study was initiated by CISONEC. So just briefly talking about the methodologies that I used, I did a desk study where I was trying to find out how other countries are actually trying to quantify non-economic loss and damage. And then after that, I spoke to different people within the different ministries related to how they actually quantify or look at disasters, what is in their assessments, what are the attributes that they put in the reports, and whether they also consider an economic loss and damage in the various assessments which they do post-disaster or even pre-disaster. And then I also had some focus group discussions and case studies. I will not talk about the global overview because that just shows what methods or tools are being used globally. But I'll focus more on the Malawi overview, which will just give us an idea as to what different sectors that are affected by climate change impacts are doing with regard to non-economic loss and damage, and what methodology or proxy we can actually use to quantify non-economic loss and damage in those sectors. So the first sector that I looked at, or the first department that I looked at, was the Department of Disaster Management Affairs. And their main tool is actually a post-disaster needs assessment. Even right now, after Cyclone Freddy, they're also doing one post-disaster needs assessment. And from that one, what they actually do, or what costs they actually look at, is the post-disaster damage costs, what has happened, or how much damage has a certain disaster caused. And then they also look at the recovery, because most of the times the recovery costs could be higher than what the actual damage has been. So those are the economic attributes which they look at. In terms of non-economic loss and damage, they do not actually incorporate that in the post-disaster needs assessments that are done in Malawi, although there is potential for that to be incorporated in the assessment too, but we just don't have the capacity right now to do that. In the agriculture sector, again, what happens after disasters or after a climatic shock, they come up with damage assessment reports. And those damage assessment reports basically look at maybe the expected yield, which was expected in a certain area. For example, if they lose livestock or they lose their crops, they are able to estimate how much they were going to get it from. And also from the market prices, they are able to determine how much they could have actually realized. So they just look at the economic attributes. So the agriculture sector does not look at non-economic loss and damage. And if you want to incorporate that within the agriculture assessments or the damage assessments, then of course we'll have to look at other methodologies to use. I'll spend more time on this one because it's to do with the environment, and they actually use economic terms or economic tools to actually try to quantify non-economic loss and damage. So from what I gathered, they use choice analysis or even just modeling. And how they actually do that, it's where it becomes a little bit subjective, because with those economic tools or those economic analysis, you can get different results depending on the communities that you use, as well as depending on the time that the assessment is undertaken. So for example, if you are asking people to do a willingness to pay assessment, you'll see that what someone is going to say is quite different from what some other person is going to say. If you look at the last column, which explains how these economic tools can be quantified to give a monetary value, then I'll be able to explain it to you. So for a cost benefit analysis, it's an analysis whereby planners, when they want to find out whether something is good or not, they do the cost benefit analysis, which just looks at the advantages that can be accrued from doing something or not doing something. The simple sense, maybe if you want to build a road and want to see whether that road will bring economic benefits or it's going to be a white elephant, you do a cost benefit analysis. So using that rationale, you can also do the same with non-economic loss and damage, whereby you can actually look at, for example, if you're trying to look in the environmental field, if you're looking at Chikangawa forest, assuming that Chikangawa forest was being depleted or being degraded because of climate change impacts, you can do a cost benefit analysis to find out what can actually happen to reduce or to minimize the loss of biodiversity in that field. And that number that comes up is what you can use as your proxy for that non-economic loss and damage. The same is about a willingness to pay. Willingness to pay, again, there's a framework where you ask people that how much are they willing to sacrifice to save something. So if we use, again, Chikangawa forest to say that, you know, how much would a company be willing to donate so that there is no harm happening to Chikangawa forest, that is their willingness to pay. When you ask them, can you donate 100 million? They might say no. Can you pay 50 million? They might say no. Can you pay 30 million? They might say yes. So that 30 million is their willingness to pay to actually save the forest or to stop that degradation. So that is also the figure or the proxy that you can use as being the value which people are attributing to a non-economic value. So that's the rationale which those economic those economic terms actually come up with. Again, the other one is the cost of a policy. Policies cost a lot. You know, you do the assessments, you do the baseline studies, the surveys, it goes to parliament, it gets passed. There's a cost attached to that. Again, that cost is what you can use as the willingness or the actual value which people are putting towards that thing which has got no value. The same is for enacting a project. You can also use that as a proxy. You can ask an organization that can they actually implement a project to save X amount of lives in a certain area. If they say, yes, we are willing to pay up to 1 million, that means that, you know, the value which you can attach to the people in that area is 1 million. So that's how we actually use the proxies to come up with the value for something else. And the other one is a foregone revenue. And that one is, again, where you say that if the forest was functioning properly, for example, maybe giving out carbon revenues or ecosystem services, if people are saying that that was actually generating X amount of money, and if climate change makes it not to be able to generate those services, then that foregone revenue, which is going to be lost, is what you can actually attach as the cost for that thing that has got no value. So that's how we do the proxies to come up with a cost for something that has got no cost. And again, so if we go to the other sectors, cultural heritage is the same. You can use the same economic assessments that I was talking about, where you have about 5 or so. They'll give you different values. And then again, you just have to decide, you know, which one is the best one to actually be using. Migration, again, it's the same. You can ask people that, under what circumstances will you be willing to move? Are you going to move from, for example, Chikwawa is a flood-prone area. You can ask them that if we were to give each one of you 10 million kwacha, would you be able to move from Chikwawa to another area? And then they'll be able to tell you that, no, that's too little. We can't start our life with that. If you increase the money, that's the proxy that you get up until you get to the amount of money that they will be willing to move. And then that's the proxy that you can use to value how much they value being together with people, or where they think that, you know, they are not at any danger. And it works the same for, you know, the policy, again, how much the policy costs. Health, again, in the health sector, they mostly look at just the damage to the infrastructure. They do not look at the non-economic loss and damage. For now, again, it's just a question of replacement costs or remedial action. And again, they can only insure their infrastructure. So that's another area that we can use. Education, again, they also just do damage assessments. But in the education sector, again, you can also consider those economic terms that I spoke about, how it's actually done to get a proxy. In the Ministry of Gender, they are able to do assessments on, loss of human capital. If someone is not going to school, how much is that a cost to society? So that's how they actually come up with a figure or a proxy of what, an impact or a climate change impact is having on people or other societies. So yeah, so just to wrap it up, again, the insurance sector, they are usually able to quantify economic costs, like you can insure your crops, you can insure your car. If damage comes, they can pay you out. They said that, although it's subjective, you can also insure things that have got tangible meanings to you, like artifacts or culture. But the problem is it increases your premium. So again, it's also up to you. How much are you willing to pay to get those things that have got no marketable value to be insured and to be replaced? So there are ways to do it. And again, most of the NGOs here just do vulnerability assessments, which actually looks at what the households have lost. They don't actually look at the non-economic loss and damages. So just to wrap it up, or the way forward, from the assessments that I used, I said that in a country like Malawi, we can actually use our own standardized approaches using those economic terms or those economic methodologies that are used for the different sectors. But again, they'll be giving you different answers. So the best way is to do 2 economic assessments using different methods, then come up with the average or the mean value which comes there. So if you do the willingness to pay, it will come up with one thing. If you do a cost benefit analysis, it will come back with another thing. So you add those 2 up and divide by 2, and then that will give you your mean, which you can say that is what the people or the non-economic loss and damage in that sector is. Again, I spoke about the Department of Disaster Management Affairs. They do the post-disaster needs assessment, but they don't include non-economic loss and damage. If they are trained on it and their tools are made available, they can start doing that. So we can also focus on that organization first as a leader, and then once they are very conversant with everything else, we can start training other people in other sectors. And lastly, we need to start taking stock of our biodiversity, our cultural heritage, and other things, not only after a disaster, but before a disaster, so that we are able to quantify them. And then when we do the assessments over time, we'll be seeing how the land is getting degraded, because these are slow onset disasters. And then we'll be able to say that, okay, this is what happened. So we should stop from reacting to disasters, but actually start having baselines of what our ecosystems are producing, as well as what culture we have and other intangible things that we have. So those were my thoughts for now, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks to Masani. So we'll take the questions after Isaac has spoken as well. So over to you, Isaac.
Thank you so much. So my name is Isaac Chua. I'm from the Malawi University of Science and Technology. So Troika also commissioned us to do a bit of work on loss and damage. So both the economic and non-economic losses and damages. So I think Dumisani has set a scene in terms of the various approaches. So what we did is to zero in, in Zomba and in Sanje, to experiment with some of the methodologies on estimating economic losses and damages. So I think of interest to me is to share some of our findings on non-economic losses and damages. So we conducted a contingent valuation survey. I think Dumisani mentioned. So you try to estimate the non-economic losses and damages from willingness to pay for the losses or damages, or willingness to accept. So that was just part of the various other methodologies that we experimented with. But of interest is that through undertaking that survey, we noticed that in different communities, they were coming up with the various valuations in terms of how you value biodiversity, culture, the psychological, impacts of disasters. So all the intangible, non-economic losses and damages. So if you ask people in terms of how much they're willing to pay or accept for the damage, then you have totally divergent, estimations. And also we notice disparities between different age groups and also between different genders. So what that gets to show is that I think in the previous speakers, one mentioned about the context specificity, the need to really surface out the specifics or the peculiarities of these things in different communities. So you cannot have a one size fits all approach because these communities are totally different. And also, in some cases, we noticed reluctance, especially in Nsanje, in one of the communities around Mbenje. They were not willing to discuss, valuation of maybe loss of life. They were resistant. So, upon probing in terms of why, it came out very clear that, they were very categorical that you cannot put value on life. So upon further discussions in the focus group discussions, eventually they're like, yeah, okay, we'll be willing to accept maybe only as compensation. So they were not willing to really, to accept, any sort of financial compensation as a form of transaction, because to them life is sacred. So you cannot really put value on life. Graveyards also was another touchy subject. So because normally when the disasters, graves get destroyed also. So when you try to discuss around maybe, the willingness to move or to accept compensation for the loss, they were not, pleased at all with that subject. And again, it also touched on the issues of beliefs and spirituality. So they were very clear that they cannot talk about, valuing graves because that would be discrediting, that sort of that space, because it's a sacred space. So they were also, very categorical that the spirits will not be happy about it. So, it gets to show that there is a limitation to the extent to which you can value these things or you can quantify in monetary terms. So what you find is that normally, I think Dumisani mentioned the various methods, they do apply, the principles of economics. So you try to deduce economic value based on certain progresses, as he mentioned. But I think from our findings, there are just certain things that, you cannot put monetary value on. So, issues of psychological, effects of disasters, gender-based violence, and also some of the effects are intergenerational. So you notice that disasters, they might impact, the present generation. For example, people get displaced, they lose, they lose things or they lose life. Those things have got spillover intergenerational effects. So how can we begin to quantify that? So I think, in my conclusion, what we are finding from this work is that I think, there is a lot of gaps in terms of understanding on how to value these things, and the existing approaches, especially those economic-based ones, are limited, as I've explained. So they have limitations, and therefore we need to think about other more innovative approaches in terms of how to capture these, bearing in mind the cultural sensitivities, especially in our African context. There are certain cultural sensitivities that we cannot, we cannot just put money on. So hence, I think I did like the presentation in the morning where they're talking about decolonizing these methodologies. We need to decolonize. So we need to think a bit more creatively and come up with certain methodologies that will be sensitive to these issues. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're going to move to the Q&A. We've had a presentation from Dr. Dumisani, who has mentioned a number of ways in which we can document loss and damage, the post-disaster needs management, the disaster assessment reports, choice analysis, and looking at issues like willingness to pay or the cost of enacting a policy, and then vulnerability assessments. And then he emphasized on the need to train disaster management centers on some of these methodologies. And then Isaac
has mentioned that they tried this in the field and there was differences with how communities perceived these issues. There's a disparity between age groups, and then there's a need to have contextual discussions. And some issues are actually non-monetary, like the psychological effects, and an interesting dimension there on intergenerational spillover. And so now we open the floor to questions directed to either Dumisani or Isaac. So, okay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you to our presenters. And well, I don't know if it's a question, but building on what Isaac just spoke to in relation to the study that Dr. Misani, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, shared with us. And as you are sharing the different sectors and the methodologies they were using, one, I think it would have been good for us to also know what is out there, you know, the other tools that are not just within Malawi. But I was also thinking, for example, when you talk about willingness to pay, who do we ask this question to, you know? I would love to know that. But I was also thinking, before actually even Isaac presented, how do we, you know, how do we value some of these things? Because Africa, we know we are very entrenched in our culture. We are highly socialized. We are so diverse. So when even a community is just separated, like what happened with Freddie, you know, the loss is beyond, it's beyond what you can really quantify. You know, we were seeing that documentary in the morning, the gentleman who was saying they don't even know where the bodies of their children are. So they have just not lost children, but even that closure of burying them, you know, so there are so many things. Societies are separated. Gabriel talked about faith. There are so many things that are very difficult to quantify. But also the other issue, for example, around forests, you know, communities conserve forests without any pay, you know, because their cultural issues are attached, social issues. So there is no money value attached to it, but they conserve those forests. So when you ask how much are you willing to pay, it is, you know, a question we have to really think through. So for me, my suggestion would be that because loss and damage, we have to accept Africa is quite at the forefront. We have to think of how do we model our own, you know, methodologies or proposals around these non-economic factors, because the economic factors are definitely going to be proposed by so many others. So how do we, you know, start to come up with these kind of models? So that's really what was going through my mind. But thank you so much for the presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, the two presenters, for the very good presentation. I think I had a question to the first presenter, but then was answered by Isaac. Because my question was not really a question, but my concern was on the capacity of the community to even negotiate. You know, when you talk of willing, you know, to accept or something, sometimes if I do not have the capacity to even negotiate, I can easily be taken advantage of. I know of a community in Tanzania, a Maasai community, because Maasais were in Kenya and Tanzania. And when the government wanted to, you know, take their area, when they're talking about a protected area, and so they wanted to take their land, they told them like, you know, we would be paying you this much amount of money to go to this place. And, you know, it really looked exciting. Well, it looked exciting. But when they got there is when they realized that, see, this was not even equivalent to what we have lost. And so there is so much need to build the capacity of the community. Otherwise, this is already a very vulnerable community, and they can easily, you know, they can easily give in for anything that doesn't even match what they are losing. They're not even able to calculate the foregone cost. With the carbon credits now being the, you know, the current, the newest baby in the block, I know, you know, it looks very glamorous, but when you look at the foregone opportunity, it is very, very high. And so it is really important to take into consideration who are, this is a community that sometimes they are not very much aware of a lot of these things happening around. And so that was my contribution, that we should really look or give a lot of interest into first understanding that the community at times lack the capacity, not just to value, but also to negotiate. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to put my question or food of thought to Isaac as well, where of course you particularly look at a couple of sectors in terms of redress, in terms of how they are affected. But for me, it's very important that we also probably look at, as the earlier discussions were emphasizing, mobility issues, that at one point, one sector may be affected and continuously because of a key sector like transport. Because if roads are washed away or other means of mobility options for the communities, that means that there is going to be remoteness at some point. So, which means that in terms of how the effects are related, there's going to be a continued effect or flow of effects that's going to be suffered by the communities that are suffering or victims. So how do we propose, especially I think building on what Bridget was saying, on the destroyed ecosystems, because then they are going to be the lead causes of some of the issues that are arising. These are just after effects. But if we deliberately destroy ecosystems such as wetland ecosystems, forest ecosystems, you definitely will suffer the consequences. So how do we speak to some of these things as we are saying we are planning land use at some point? Because we should not just react to situations. For me, that's where the problem is. If you're firefighting issues, then that means you're not doing enough to generate knowledge, to build on the existing practices, but also to learn from the past experiences. I thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take just one more question from Steve, and then Isaac responds, and then we will have another round.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my name is Steve, and thanks to the presenters. I think there's a point that wasn't very clear about the first presentation. Your last recommendation about doing, I think, an inventory on how maybe you can explain a little bit and whether it's been done elsewhere. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so yeah, I can start with the last question about the inventory. So again, we are looking at different sectors. What usually happens, for example, here in Malawi is that, if the World Bank wants to do a project, that's when we do the baselines to find out what species we have in a certain area or what's there. Even in the cultural sectors, heritage, they do the heritage assessment only when there's a new project being proposed. So the inventory I was talking about is that even right now we've got other things that are being degraded slowly, but because nobody is paying attention to it, we don't actually know or value what it is to us. It's only after maybe 10 years, that's when we know the value. For example, where I come from here in towns, I think you're talking about wetlands. Nobody values the wetlands in towns. They think that they get more money from building apartments in those, in those wetlands, because they can see that they're going to make more money from it. But after some time, when disasters like this happen, that's when you get to understand that, oh, that was the true value of the wetland, to actually mitigate some of these storm flows or the water flows. So that's what I was trying to say, that even right now, we should be trying to look at which areas might actually be affected by slow onset disasters or slow onset changes in the 10 to 15-year horizon, not only when there's a big project coming in and we want to find or to minimize the damage. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. And with the other ones directed to me and Isaac, yes, we think that, yes, your comments are very, very apt. And there are things that I think we can also look forward when we are going forward. When you are talking about, the willingness to pay, yes, indeed. I also come from Blantyre, and although there were floods in Blantyre, Cyclone Freddy, but I haven't been affected. So how I perceive them is not the same as how other people would perceive them. The only damage to our house was a brick fence, a wall, but we know that other people have lost lives. So if you ask me my willingness to pay for something or for the government to do something, it's definitely going to be lower than the other people that have lost lives and more livelihoods. So yes, those gaps are there, but we are trying to build a case going forward. And then these are just, the learning cases. And I think we'll be able to build even from what we are learning here to say, what is next. The proposals about something that is, African context, with burial sites, as well as the other things that we take, the other things that we value more than maybe our Western counterparts. So we'll take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Indeed, I think Dumisani, you're right. And also the comments and observations and questions are important ones. They do set another challenge because, once you start engaging in this field, you keep uncovering more and more unanswered questions. The issue that Madame mentioned in terms of, who negotiates and on whose behalf, touches on power relationships and dynamics in the community too. So when you are conducting this kind of work, you need to be, sensitive to, who participates and how do they participate. Because sometimes we also noticed that when you do combine men and women in the same group, they tended to be silent somehow. But maybe you conduct focus group discussions separately, then they'll express themselves. So there are also certain power asymmetries in the communities that do play a major role in these issues. So when conducting this kind of work, we need to think carefully about how we design, the research or whatever interventions we are doing, so that we do not end up reproducing the marginalizations within the communities. And another critical issue you mentioned, indeed, there are just certain things that you can't value, you can't put money on. Maybe sadly, we live in a capitalist economy where money matters, but perhaps maybe there is a case here, maybe for more ethnographic approaches, maybe colleagues in anthropology, maybe we need to uncover other ways of valuing things rather than maybe just valuing things through money. So I think here I'm making a case for more qualitative-minded research methodologies that maybe we can borrow from social sciences or humanities, art also. I know that, colleagues at GLO, they're using art to capture some of these things. So I think we can demonstrate that there's damage, but not necessarily by showing the numbers, but just creating the visual effects, I guess, of maybe the suffering, or maybe through the stories of the victims also. So that can demonstrate a case that indeed these things are happening and they're having unimaginable impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. Very insightful comments over there about the need to move maybe towards qualitative data, looking at ethnography to see if we can collect data on non-economic losses, and also a very important insight over there on negotiations and power imbalance. So I'll pick one more question from my colleague there from CADECOM, and then because we only have 5 minutes to go, I don't know if we'll be closing out anyone. Okay, my colleague there from UN, and then we will wrap up. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for offering this opportunity to ask. I have a question to Dr. Isaac, of which in your presentation you mentioned of in focus discussions you are trying in Nsanje is denied to give a value to a lost life, but but the compensation. So I'm interested in the compensation. What are the factor that maybe we are considering or they were suggesting to factor in to come up with the compensation value for the lost life? Thank you.
Mine is not a question, but a sort of addition. I'm looking at two issues. One is a framework of compensation. What parameters should be put in place so that this compensation is guided in a realistic manner? Instead of asking who is willing to pay, and you find that, like she said, it's open to manipulation, especially when there is corruption. So
like a policy framework that guides compensation. What parameters should we look at? And number two, we should also consider indigenous knowledge. There's a way people used to do things, even when there is loss of life. There is a way traditionally people, communities used to compensate for life. So these non-tangible things, there is we borrow from tradition, and also we look at a guideline that is reasonable, that can be adopted across communities. Thank you.
Indeed, I think the last comment is an important comment. The application of indigenous knowledge in this work has a big role to play. I can't agree more with you. So on your question about factors or the underlying, thinking around compensation. So normally, I think in probing around this issue, you tend to notice that again, there are variations. If, for example, is a man, normally a man is taken as a breadwinner. So they will look at what he was able to provide, and also maybe loss of livelihood, loss of income. So it was mainly to do with somebody's contribution to family and also community. And again, as I mentioned, it was a touchy subject because there were also quite debates in terms of what figure to put, because you would ask them, can you put a figure on all those things you're describing? There were also contestations around that. So I think the key message is that for example, I think one woman mentioned that if I lose my husband, for example, my husband gives me emotional support. So how can I value that? So if I lose my child, my child, makes me happy when I see him or I see her. So when I lose her, I'll be sad for the rest of my life. So no money can buy that love back. So you notice that the figures were mainly around the productivity of somebody, and there was a tendency to also have variations there. But I think the key message there is that it was clear from the participants that they were not willing to put value on life because of what I've mentioned, of the things I've mentioned. So I think it relates to the point the good doctor was mentioning, to say I think we need maybe to uncover certain traditional ways in which we value these things, rather than maybe just focusing on money. Yeah, so I think there's a case there for colleagues, as I mentioned, that are into serious ethnographic work and also anthropology, especially anthropological studies. We need to undertake a more in-depth sort of research to uncover some of these things. Because normally with the existing studies, you go in, they tend to be short-term. You go in, you collect data, and you move out. But perhaps if you embed yourself in the community, you study the community, understand how they look at life and how they value things, probably maybe we can document these things better, rather than just having a once-off sort of interaction with the communities. Thank you.
Okay, so by the powers vested in me, I'd like to close the Q&A. I invite Connor to wrap up the session.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So unfortunately, our other two panelists, Dr. Kazembe and Gabrielle Robbins, they haven't been able to join us today, but I'm sure their presentations will be shared as part of the final workshop report. So I think, as Chimamwe said at the start of the session, we're not going to go back into plenary now. We'll come back in the morning. We start at 9 a.m., Julius? 8:30. So if we can all be back at 8:30, we'll do the plenary discussion on the sessions that happened today, and we'll also do a brief recap. So thank you for your participation today. I think it was a great day. Lots of interesting discussions, lots of learning to take forward within our programming. So thank you very much, and see you tomorrow morning.
So one last thing before we go, just to thank all of you for your resilience. I think the discussion here was very wonderful, and the last bit that we're trying to also crystallize, I think is very important. And what we need to remember, Dr. Isaac indicated that unfortunately we are in the capitalist world. So even though we want to see how indigenous knowledge, how we want to value things in a certain way, but when you go into the UNFCCC process, someone needs you to propose a figure, unfortunately. So I think that's a challenge that we have as Africans. How do we quantify our own resources, our own losses, whether economic or non-economic, so that when we get into these spaces, at least we are talking figures, numbers, monies. And that's what even when you look at the work of the Transitional Committee, they're trying to look into that. If, for example, we set up this funding mechanism, by the end of the day, they would want to also see how best they can even compensate, let's say, loss of life by the end of the day. So unfortunately, we are living in that, world. We still need to find ways on how we can quantify economically our non-economic things, so that we can make our case, louder and also make it easier for the rest of the world. So I was just putting this as something that should actually be teasing our mind, because yeah, we know we can't quantify, but someone also wants us to quantify. And then how do we strike a balance? So thank you. I think let's just, as we are concluding, yeah, so I was about to talk about logistics. I think a number of us who have been invited, and we know who we are supposed to be meeting. I think you were invited by the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. I mean, not invited as separate, but then if you got communication from them, you'll be sorted out tomorrow, because I think there was a hitch in terms of the flights for the accountant was supposed to be in today, but I think eventually will be coming tomorrow. So the information that I got is that tonight, at least, please try to save yourself. If you have something, buy dinner, and then that will be compensated to you, I think, tomorrow. So for any other, for those that are based in Malawi, I think you got communication from us as the System Secretariat. I think there's an accountant is around. I think you go down there. Otherwise, I think let me also congratulate you for the wonderful session, and let's meet tomorrow. 8:30, I think why we're saying 8:30 is because we want to start with a recap. We're supposed to go back to the main plenary and then have a general discussion on what is coming out. But since, because of time, we just want to see if we can combine this discussion and what we're supposed to discuss tomorrow as a recap. So I think it will actually make sense if we can combine the two, so that we can also allow you, before it gets too dark, for some of you maybe to just walk around. Thank you and have a good night.